Hello everyone. Before getting to know more about the security concepts, let's dive into the introduction to most of the basic security terminologies. So starting off, we have a couple of basic terminologies that we'll be using in this presentation. The first one we have is threat, which is basically an event or an action that has got the ability to compromise the system or to violate the security. Then we have exploit, which is basically a way to breach the security of a machine through a loophole or a vulnerability. Then we have vulnerability, which is generally defined as the existence of a loophole or a weakness in the design or the implementation that could lead to undesirable or unexpected event that would compromise the machine. Attacker, any individual who compromises the security of the machine illegitimately in order to steal the data or manipulate or to cause destruction of the data. Attack, the action that is performed by an attacker that would potentially harm the system or the information stored in it. Data theft, the action of information stealing from the victim's machine is called the data theft. So, computer security in general has got plenty of meanings, but two of the major ones would be the ones that we have given here. Basically, computer security is the protection of the computer system from the theft or damage to either the software, hardware, or to the information present on the system. It generally involves the process of safeguarding against the intruders from gaining access to your systems or its resources for malicious purposes. So what are the different laws that would be possible because of the security attacks? The first and most common is the financial loss. It's quite common that most of the banks today or most of the bigger organizations today are having a bigger financial loss because of various different security attacks. The next would be the resource unavailability. It's quite common that once the attacker gets access to the system or the victim's machine, he would make sure that the resources are unavailable for the legitimate users. The next would be identity theft, about which we would be talking in a couple of other slides. But in general, the identity theft is basically a concept wherein an attacker would try to steal the credentials or the information pertaining to the victim and try to impersonate himself as the victim itself. Next we have is data loss. It's quite common that once an attacker compromises the system, he would try and steal the data or try to perform any sort of an attack that would later cause the data loss of the data. Then we have loss of trust. It's quite common that bigger organizations, once they get compromised, it's quite common to see that people would lose trust in that organization in terms of security or safeguarding their assets in the organization. Then resources misuse. It is also known that when an attacker compromises the victim's machine, first thing he would do is the misuse of the resource that he's got access to. Elements of security. So these are 5 different elements of security that's really important and based on which the whole security is made of. Firstly, it is confidentiality, which basically is ensuring that the information is accessible only to those who are authorized and have access. The next we have is integrity, which is to make sure that the information is accurate, reliable, and also complete, and it is in its original form. Then we have availability, which is basically to ensure that the information is accessible to authorized persons when required without any sort of a delay. Then we have authenticity, which is the identification and assurance of the information's origin. Deny that the authenticity of their signature on a particular document. So let's consider the various different layers of security. So firstly, we have physical security, then network security, then system security, then application security, and user security. So under the physical security, It basically involves the safeguarding of the personal or the hardware programs, or be it the network peripherals, from the physical threats. Then next we have is network security, which would basically be summed up as the protection of the networks and their services from unauthorized modification or destruction. Then we have system security, which is basically to protect the system and the information from any sort of a threat, such as unauthorized access or corruption or being misused. Then we have the application security. So this would cover the way the softwares are generally being used, or even be it the hardware or any sort of procedural methods that could be taken care for protecting the application. The next we would have is user security, which basically is to ensure that an authenticated and an authorized user is only allowed to log in and perform any sort of functionalities he's authorized to do. What are the risks that are pertaining to the domestic users? So it's quite common nowadays that the whole world is going digital, and it's also quite common that most of the domestic users would be susceptible to these different kind of attacks. So the first one would be the email attacks. Basically, the victim would be susceptible to attacks such as phishing or spamming or any other sort of scams. And next we have is malware attacks. So right after the email attacks, we have malware attacks. Basically, it's quite well known that emails are the biggest carriers of the malwares. So henceforth, it falls under the second attacks that the domestic users are susceptible to. Then we have the DOS attacks, which is nothing but the denial of service attacks, which is basically the unavailability of a service for a legitimate user. Because when an attacker wants to compromise or compromise that machine or that IP address, he would bombard that particular IP with enormous amount of packets that the service goes down. The next is identity theft, which basically involves an attacker to impersonate the targeted victim and try to use it for his personal gains. The next is packet sniffing. This would involve the attacker to intercept and try to get some information out of the communication that's been happening around. So what are the things that are to be secured? So the first thing would be the hardware. Basically, that would include your storage devices or your hard disks or your laptops or your smartphones for that matter. Then you would have to make sure that you secure your softwares as well, right from the operating system to all other applications that come under it. Then you would have the information that is to be secured, right from the personal identification credentials such as the credit card details or any sort of health related details or banking details, etc. The next would be the securing of the communication, right from your instant messaging or any sort of browsing activities or your mails or any activities that you perform on the social media. So what are the things that make your system vulnerable? The first thing would be low security awareness, then no implementation of security systems, then default settings for applications and software, then not following the standard security guidelines, then insecure online activity. So how do you make your system secure? First thing, you need to implement data access controls. So which would basically involve, you got to monitor the system activities or activities that happen onto your system, such as who is accessing what kind of file or what kind of data. And the next would be system and security administration. So make sure that you always perform a regular check and based on the security administration tasks, such as whether configuring the system settings or implementing any sort of policies pertaining to security as such. Then next we have a system access control. This is basically to make sure that only the authorized users get access to the files that they're allowed to access. Then next would be the system design, which would basically include different security implementations being brought into the actual software design, such as privilege isolation or any sort of such secure system designs. So what are the basic security guidelines? So the first would be the use of strong passwords, or even the use of strong and complex passwords. Then you have the use of antivirus, then regular backing up of your important files and documents, then using encryption and digital signatures, then using firewalls and intrusion detection systems, then regularly updating your operating system and other applications, not revealing too much of information on online social networking sites, awareness of the present world security scenario and new attacks.